She had been told to expect cruelty. A young Japanese nurse, barely 20 years old, sat on a wooden bench inside a makeshift medical station, her uniform torn, her sleeve bloodied. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp canvas. Across from her, an American medic bent carefully over her arm, winding a clean white bandage with deliberate care. His hands were steady, his voice quiet, as if he were tending to his own sister. She could not understand the words he spoke, but she understood the tone. Not hatred, not triumph, but something she had not expected at all, gentleness. Around her, other women sat with steaming bowls of stew, eating more in a single meal than they had in days. Some were given new uniforms, washed and folded, while others had their wounds cleaned. It was not paradise, not yet. It was confusion. For years, she had been taught that capture was worse than death. Bushido, the ancient code of the warrior, had filtered down from the samurai into the veins of soldiers and auxiliaries alike. To surrender was to dishonor one's family, one's ancestors, one's emperor. The shame was supposed to be unbearable. She had whispered the oath herself, during training, better to die than be taken. Every woman here had. They believed surrender would lead to humiliation, starvation, or torture so cruel that death would seem a mercy. That was what their commanders had promised. That was what their families expected. Yet now, in this tent with its smell of coffee and bread, the myth was beginning to collapse. The clash of expectation and reality was almost unbearable. When the Americans first approached, she had braced for a rifle butt, for mocking laughter, for the leering gaze of victors. Instead, one had offered her a cigarette. Another had handed her a canteen of water. When the medic touched her arm to examine the wound, she flinched as though struck. But he only frowned, nodded, and set about his work. She found herself staring at the bandage, so clean against her bruised skin, and wondering if it was some kind of trick. The war she had left behind had no room for such moments. In the Pacific Theater, she had witnessed soldiers abandoned by their own units, left to bleed out because they were too weak to keep marching. She had seen rations divided into slivers of rice, sometimes stretched with bark or sawdust. She had seen officers strike subordinates across the face for faltering under exhaustion. This was discipline, they were told. This was honor. Suffering was the currency of loyalty. Mercy was weakness. That was the world she knew, until now. Facts tell part of this story. Between 35,000 and 50,000 Japanese soldiers, and a smaller but still significant number of women, would be taken as prisoners before the end of the war in August 1945. They had all been told the same tale, that the enemy would strip them of dignity, subject them to tortures so vile that suicide was preferable. Yet what they encountered instead was often the opposite. American camps, governed by the Geneva Convention, were built not on cruelty but on procedure, on the idea that a prisoner kept alive and well was worth more than one brutalized. For the Americans, a healthy captive was a source of intelligence, of propaganda, of moral superiority. For the Japanese, the very existence of such treatment was unthinkable. But numbers and treaties cannot convey what it felt like for a 20-year-old nurse to receive soup instead of scorn. She had not tasted meat in weeks. The broth was rich, oily on her lips, steaming with vegetables she had forgotten the names of. When she swallowed, her body trembled, not just with hunger but with disbelief. Beside her, another woman, older, wiped her mouth and wept openly. To cry over stew might seem absurd, even laughable. Yet in that moment the food was not just food, it was proof that the enemy saw them as human. The irony was sharp. While Japanese propaganda insisted that American captivity meant degradation, here were guards who learned their names, doctors who treated their wounds, cooks who handed out bread as if feeding comrade. Meanwhile, Allied prisoners in Japanese camps faced starvation rations, bamboo cages, and backbreaking labor. 1 in 3 would die. The comparison was staggering, almost grotesque. One side built survival into its prison policy, the other built death. Still, trust did not come easily. Some women refused food at first, convinced it must be poisoned. Others hid the chocolate they were given, certain it was bait. The nurse herself hesitated when the medic offered her a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward like incense. She had never tasted it before. When she finally drank, the bitterness startled her tongue. She coughed, and the medic chuckled softly, shaking his head as though amused by her innocence. That small, human sound, the laugh of an enemy, pierced her armor more deeply than any bullet. The shock was not only physical but cultural. These women had been raised in a system that stripped them of individuality. They were auxiliaries, functionaries, pieces of the great war machine. Their comfort did not matter. Their suffering was proof of devotion. And yet here, in the hands of their supposed foes, they were treated as individuals. A bed meant one body mattered. A blanket meant warmth was not weakness. A bandage meant healing was worth the effort. These simple things, so ordinary to the Americans, struck like revelations to the women who received them. It was a world turned upside down. Soldiers who had been prepared to die now found themselves fed. Nurses who had been ready to be shamed found themselves respected. Even the silence of the camp at night was disorienting. No shouted orders, no ritual punishments, only the distant hum of guards speaking quietly among themselves, the faint notes of a harmonica carried across the barracks. Some women lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they had stepped not into captivity but into some strange dream. There was fear, yes, but also the first sparks of something far more dangerous: curiosity. If the Americans were not monsters, what else had been a lie? If capture was not dishonor, what then was honor? These questions began to ripple silently through the group, whispered in the dark, scribbled in letters home when aloud. For the nurse, the moment came when she was handed not just food, not just bandages, but a pencil and a sheet of paper. She was told she could write to her family. She stared at the page for a long time. She had been told such a thing was impossible, that the enemy would never allow words to travel freely. Yet here it was, the blank paper waiting. She wrote, "Mother, I am alive. They feed me. They treat me kindly. I do not understand this war anymore." That letter, like so many others, would be intercepted by Japanese intelligence. Its contents would trouble those who read it. How could paradise exist inside a prison? How could dignity bloom behind barbed wire? She did not know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The bandage on her arm was not just cloth. It was a thread unraveling an entire belief system, one that would leave her, and her nation, facing questions far more painful than any wound. The first morning in the camp felt like stepping into another universe. The women awoke not to shouted orders or the clatter of boots, but to the faint smell of bacon drifting through the barrack. The air was cool, the light soft through the slats of the wooden walls, and for a moment they lay still, half convinced it was some trick of the senses. Then came the call for breakfast, not barked in anger but spoken with steady routine. They shuffled uncertainly into line, their steps hesitant, as though expecting at any moment the illusion to collapse. Instead, they were handed trays laden with eggs, bread, and steaming mugs of coffee. Some women stared, frozen. One whispered that it must be a test. But when they watched the American guards sit down with their own plates, eating the same food without hesitation, suspicion began to erode. The young nurse lifted her fork with trembling fingers. She had known hunger so sharp it gnawed at her bones. Now, with the first bite, her body jolted awake. The richness of yolk on her tongue, the warmth of bread soft against her teeth, these sensations were almost violent in their novelty. Tears stung her eyes. Around her, others devoured the food with quiet desperation, their dignity battling their hunger. One woman laughed suddenly, a sound edged with hysteria, and covered her mouth in shame. Yet no guard shouted, no punishment fell. The guards only glanced over with mild curiosity, as though laughter, even here, was permissible. The beds themselves were revelations. Wooden frames, thin mattresses, real blankets. After months of sleeping on dirt floors or bamboo mats, The act of lying down on something soft felt indecent, as though comfort itself were a betrayal. The nurse sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the blanket as though it might vanish. For the first time since leaving home, she had an object that was hers alone. That blanket became a symbol, not just of warmth, but of worth. The camp was not luxurious by any means. Barbed wire still coiled along its borders, guards still stood watch with rifles. Yet the atmosphere pulsed with a strange contradiction, captivity laced with kindness. In the afternoons, the women were offered work assignments, voluntary, not forced. Some chose to help in the kitchens, learning how Americans baked bread with yeast instead of rice flour. Others swept the grounds or tended to gardens. One day, the nurse was handed a small packet of seeds, and when she asked why, the guard gestured toward a patch of earth and said something she did not understand, but the meaning was clear enough: grow something. To a woman trained to patch wounds and administer morphine, the thought of coaxing life from soil felt foreign. Yet her fingers trembled not with fear but with a strange excitement. Letters were another astonishment. The prisoners were told they could write home. Skepticism was immediate. Surely these letters would never reach Japan. But when they were given paper and pencils, the women sat in silence, staring at the blank sheet. Slowly, words spilled onto the page. One wrote of the meals, another of the warmth of her bed, another of the bandages changed by American doctors. Their voices, once silenced by the weight of Bushido, now found expression in ink. Those letters would later pass through censors, eventually landing in the hands of Japanese authorities, who found themselves reading testimonies that directly contradicted their own propaganda. In the evenings, there was time for recreation. The guards provided books, some in English, some translated into simple Japanese. There were musical instruments too, harmonicas, even a piano in one camp. One evening, the nurse sat outside as a fellow prisoner played a hesitant melody, the notes drifting across the compound. She closed her eyes, hearing not victory songs or military marches, but something tender, almost childlike. It was music for the sake of beauty alone. In her world, beauty had always been suspect, a distraction from duty. Here, it was permitted. The irony was thick enough to taste. While these women adjusted to 3 meals a day, their families back in Japan survived on rations so thin that children gnawed on bark to dull their hunger. Allied reports estimated that the average Japanese civilian consumed fewer than 200 calories daily in 1944. Meanwhile, in the American camps, prisoners gained weight, their cheeks filling out, their bodies regaining strength. The paradox was cruel. Captivity offered more life than freedom had. At first, many of the women recoiled from these comforts, clinging to the notion that to accept them was dishonor. Some ate with rigid posture, refusing to show gratitude. Others tucked food into pockets, convinced the kindness would end abruptly. But over time, survival eroded ideology. A stomach full of eggs had more persuasive power than a pamphlet of slogans. The nurse herself found that each night, as she pulled the blanket around her shoulders, the voice in her head that whispered shame grew quieter. In its place rose another whisper, maybe I am worth this. Yet the dissonance gnawed at them. How could enemies treat them better than their own officers had? How could strangers care about wounds their comrades had ignored? One woman, once beaten by her superior for collapsing from fever, stared at her arm where an American doctor had given her medicine. She said nothing, but in her silence was a question louder than any words. There were moments of unexpected humor too. The first time the women were offered peanut butter, confusion reigned. One dipped a cautious finger into the brown paste, sniffed, then licked. Her expression twisted as though betrayed, and she spat it out to the laughter of the guards. Another tried again, and another, until eventually even the nurse found herself smiling, bemused by the strange, sticky sweetness. In that laughter was a crack in the wall of fear. The Americans, far from tormentors, seemed almost amused companions in this odd experiment of captivity. Still, beneath the warmth lay a deeper current. Each act of kindness chipped away at the foundations of what these women believed about honor and war. If surrender did not mean disgrace, then what had they been dying for? If the enemy could be gentle, then who truly was the barbarian? These questions lingered in every bowl of soup, every clean bandage, every note of music drifting in the night. The nurse, once certain that her life belonged only to the emperor, now lay awake on her narrow mattress, tracing the knots in the wooden ceiling. She thought of her mother, thin and hungry in a house without fuel, of her brothers marching in ragged uniforms. She thought of the stew, the laughter, the seeds waiting to be planted. She felt as though she stood on the edge of two worlds, one collapsing, one unknown. What unsettled her most was not the comfort itself, but the idea it carried, that her life, her individual life, mattered. That realization was more destabilizing than any weapon. Because once dignity is tasted, it cannot be forgotten. And as the weeks stretched on, as the letters traveled across oceans, as whispers of this strange paradise reached the ears of those still fighting, the implications would ripple far beyond the fences of the camp. The days in captivity began to take on a rhythm, steady and almost disarming. Morning reveille, breakfast of eggs or porridge, then hours that stretched wide with possibilities none of the women had expected. The barbed wire was still there, sharp against the horizon, yet within its bounds something subtler unfolded. It was not simply survival. It was the slow, quiet revolution of dignity. The young nurse found herself in a classroom one afternoon, a stub of chalk pressed into her hand. The board before her bore English letters carefully written by a volunteer guard who doubled as a teacher. She hesitated, heart hammering, before tracing her own shaky attempt at the word home. The guard nodded with encouragement, the simple gesture carrying weight she could not explain. She had never been asked to learn for her own sake. Education in her world had been about service, about sharpening herself into a tool. Here, learning was offered as if she mattered beyond her usefulness. That small word on the chalkboard opened a door she had never known existed. Letters from the camp became another kind of classroom. When she wrote to her mother, she struggled at first, the words stilted, awkward. What could she confess? That she was well fed while her family starved? That American doctors checked her wounds with more care than her commanding officers ever had? She settled on simple truths. The food was warm, the beds clean, the guards oddly kind. She did not understand it, but she wanted her mother to know she lived. Weeks later, when whispers reached her that such letters were intercepted and read by Japanese officials, she wondered what those men in Tokyo thought as they handled her words. Did they recognize the cracks spreading in the story they had spun? Medicine became another battlefield of perception. One woman, plagued by toothache for years, was led to a camp dentist. The chair was cold metal, the lamp harsh, but when the American leaned over and spoke softly, she realized with a jolt that he intended to ease her pain. Moments later, the rotten tooth was gone, and for the first time in years she felt relief. She touched her jaw in disbelief. No officer in her own army would have spared her from such suffering. The act was not just medical, it was radical. Pain, she realized, was not inevitable. It could be answered with compassion. Even faith found room within the camp. A few of the women set up a small shrine with stones and scraps of wood, arranging it discreetly in a corner. They expected it might be torn down, yet when an American guard saw it, he only nodded and walked on. The permission was startling. To practice devotion without scrutiny felt like inhaling after years underwater. Others attended informal gatherings where Christian chaplains offered words of comfort, not with force, but with the strange, unpressured gentleness that left them unsettled. Choice itself was foreign. The Empire had demanded worship, the Americans allowed it. Music, too, slipped into their lives like contraband joy. On quiet nights, the sound of a harmonica drifted over the compound, played by a guard or sometimes by a prisoner who had learned from him. The notes were clumsy, but they carried warmth. The nurse would sit on her bunk, eyes closed, imagining a world beyond war. Music had always been about ceremony or command. Here, it existed for beauty alone, a reminder that there was more to life than orders shouted through megaphones. With every day, the contrast deepened. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were being worked to exhaustion in mines and jungles, their bodies wasting, their spirits crushed. Reports estimated 1 in 3 would die before liberation. Yet here, the Japanese women's cheeks filled, their strength returned, their laughter re-emerged. The dissonance was unbearable. They had been told Americans were demons, yet demons did not provide sewing kits or books or blankets against the cold. Each kindness was a blow against the wall of fear, and that wall was beginning to crumble. The revolution was not loud. It came in glances, in quiet confessions, in the way the women began to carry themselves. The nurse noticed that she no longer hunched with shame when guards passed. Instead, she met their eyes cautiously, acknowledging humanity across the divide. Another woman who had once hidden her food began to eat openly, no longer fearing it would be snatched away. Small changes, almost invisible, yet together they formed something monumental. Still, shame lingered. Some women whispered at night that they could never face their families, that surrender was unforgivable no matter how they were treated. One even considered ending her life within the camp, so heavy was the burden of dishonor. Yet it was another prisoner who stopped her, gripping her hands tightly and whispering, "If the enemy values our lives, why do we not?" That question hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. It was the seed of transformation, worth discovered through the eyes of supposed foes. The Americans, perhaps unknowingly, wielded kindness as a weapon more potent than any rifle. Intelligence flowed more easily from lips unbroken by torture, offered freely by those who felt a debt to repay. But something deeper was at work. These women were not merely cooperating, they were awakening to the radical notion that dignity was not tied to obedience or death. It was a birthright, something no emperor or general could erase. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the barracks roof, the nurse held in her hands a pair of spectacles newly fitted for her eyes. She slipped them on, and the world sharpened. Lines became clear, edges distinct, faces visible in ways they had not been for years. She blinked back tears. The American doctor who had handed them to her said simply, "No one should live in a blur." She understood enough to catch the meaning. Vision, yes, but also clarity. For the first time, she saw not only the world, but herself, more sharply. These transformations did not come without cost. They tore at loyalties, shook foundations. What did it mean to serve an empire that starved you while your enemies fed you? What did it mean to honor a code that demanded your death when life itself offered such unexpected mercy? Each woman wrestled with these questions alone, yet together they formed a silent chorus of doubt. The nurse often returned to her blanket at night, clutching its edge, remembering the oath she had once sworn, better to die than surrender. Now she lay alive, warm and fed, unsure if she had betrayed her country or if her country had betrayed her. That uncertainty became the true wound, deeper than any shrapnel, harder to heal. And beyond the camp, rumors began to spread across battlefields, rumors of prisoners treated well, of women writing letters, of dignity preserved behind fences. Soldiers who once charged into hopeless battles now hesitated, if only for a breath, wondering if capture might not be the end. That hesitation was dangerous, not just to the Empire's armies but to its very soul. The nurse did not yet know the full weight of what was happening. She only knew that when she looked in the mirror one evening, borrowed from the infirmary, she saw more than a prisoner staring back. She saw a human being, valuable, irreplaceable, alive. And once that realization took root, there was no going back. What she could not imagine was how this quiet revolution would echo far beyond the fences, reshaping not only her own life but the course of an entire nation still clinging to myths. The war ended not with the thunder of artillery but with silence. When the announcement came, the women in the camps did not cheer. They sat stunned, staring at the ground, unsure whether to believe it. Japan had surrendered. The empire that demanded they die rather than be captured had bowed its head. The barbed wire still framed their view, but its meaning shifted. It no longer marked them as prisoners of an ongoing war, it marked them as witnesses to its end. Repatriation began slowly. Trains, ships, and convoys were organized to return them to a homeland they had not seen in years. The young nurse boarded a vessel bound for Yokohama, clutching a small bundle of belongings the Americans had allowed her to keep: a blanket, a pair of spectacles, and the letter she had written to her mother. The sea stretched endlessly, gray and vast, and she wondered what awaited her. Would she be welcomed as a survivor or shunned as a traitor? Would the kindness she had known in captivity dissolve the moment she set foot on Japanese soil? The Japan she returned to was unrecognizable. Cities reduced to rubble, families starving, children hollow-eyed with hunger. Her home was gone, her mother thinner than she could bear to see. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer. The people spoke in hushed voices of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of firestorms and surrender. And yet, amid this devastation, the nurse carried memories of abundance. Hot meals, clean sheets, doctors who cared. To speak of such things felt dangerous, almost obscene, yet she could not erase them. The contrast gnawed at her. How could captivity have offered more humanity than freedom? Other women shared similar stories. They spoke quietly, in corners and whispers, about American guards who remembered their names, about nights filled with music, about the first time they had been treated as individuals rather than tools of the state. Some admitted they had learned English, others confessed they had read American books. For a few, these experiences became seeds of transformation. They found themselves questioning everything they had been taught: the worth of sacrifice, the meaning of honor, the role of women beyond service to empire. The revolution that had begun behind barbed wire did not end with release. It followed them home. Not all could bear the weight. Some returned to families who viewed them with suspicion, ashamed that they had surrendered at all. A few never spoke of their captivity again, burying the memory as though silence could erase it. Yet others carried their testimonies into the fragile new Japan, telling neighbors that the Americans had not been demons but men, flawed yet compassionate. Their words unsettled those who had built their identity on fear of the enemy. For the occupation forces, these voices became unexpected bridges, proof that coexistence was possible. Intelligence officers later admitted that humane treatment of prisoners had reaped rewards far beyond expectations. Cooperation flowed naturally from people who felt respected. Military secrets were shared not out of fear but from a strange sense of debt, even gratitude. Some historians argued that this policy may have shortened the war by months, saving countless lives. But for the women themselves, the real legacy was not strategic. It was personal. They had glimpsed a world where dignity was not earned by suffering, but given freely. One afternoon, months after her return, the nurse sat with her mother in the ruins of their home. They boiled weeds for soup, the broth thin and bitter. Her mother asked softly about the camp, her eyes avoiding her daughter's face. The nurse hesitated, then described the meals, the beds, the letters. She spoke of spectacles placed on her nose by an American doctor, of the moment she saw clearly for the first time in years. Her mother wept quietly, not from shame but from relief. "At least," she whispered, "someone remembered you were human." The irony was unbearable. The empire had promised glory and delivered starvation. The enemy had promised nothing and delivered kindness. It was as though the world itself had flipped upside down. The women who lived through this paradox could never see war the same way again. Some became advocates for peace, their voices small but insistent in a society struggling to rebuild. Others carried their memories silently, letting them shape the way they raised children, teaching them that compassion could be stronger than cruelty. Even decades later, when historians interviewed former female prisoners, their words carried the same astonishment. One recalled, "They gave me chocolate and I did not believe it was real. I thought it must be a trick. But then I saw the guard eat the same piece. That moment changed me. If the enemy could share chocolate, what else could the world share? Another said, I learned English in the camp. I still speak it. Sometimes I dream in it. These testimonies, fragile yet powerful, formed a mosaic of experiences that defied the simple narratives of propaganda. The quiet revolution of dignity did not topple governments, but it shifted lives. It showed that even in the darkest war, kindness could fracture the hardest ideology. The nurse, who once believed her only worth was in service to the emperor, now knew otherwise. She had been valued by strangers. She had been treated as if her pain mattered, as if her hunger deserved relief, as if her vision deserved clarity. That knowledge was indelible. It could not be taken back. The Americans may not have intended to spark transformation. Their policies were pragmatic, rooted in Geneva Convention obligations and strategic thinking. Yet the unintended consequence was a revelation, that humane treatment could win battles no bomb ever could. The Empire's command had demanded death before dishonor. The Americans had shown that life, preserved with dignity, could be more powerful. The nurse carried these truths quietly, yet they colored everything. When she walked through ruined streets, when she watched occupation soldiers hand out rations to children, when she held her mother's hand at night, she remembered the camp not as a prison but as a strange, paradoxical paradise. Not paradise of luxury, but paradise of humanity, of discovering worth where she least expected it. And so, the story of these women does not end at the barbed wire. It lingers in the silence of their memories, in the subtle changes they brought to their families, in the testimony they left behind. It lingers in the simple objects they carried home, spectacles, letters, blankets, that became symbols of a truth larger than war. For in the end, the greatest shock was not that the Americans had treated them kindly. It was that kindness itself could survive a world devoted to destruction, that dignity could bloom in captivity, that even enemies could remind you of your humanity. And as whispers of these experiences spread, first through families, then through villages, then across oceans, they carried with them a question that unsettled victors and vanquished alike. If paradise could exist inside a prison, what did that say about the world outside?